Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 23rd of October. I'm Andrew Wilson, and thank you for joining me for the Full Scottish. This afternoon, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 242 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our two guests for this afternoon, and then together we will look in a little more depth at the past week's key headlines from Scotland and around the world. Russian-installed authorities have ordered all residents of the southern Ukrainian city of Kherson to leave immediately, ahead of an expected advance by Ukrainian troops waging a counter-offensive to recapture it. The regional pro-Kremlin administration called on civilians to use boat crossings over a major river to move deeper into Russian-held territory, citing a tense situation on the front and the threat of shelling and alleged terror attacks by Kyiv, Associated Press is reporting. On Friday, Ukrainian forces bombarded Russian positions across the region, targeting resupply routes. More than a dozen Russian missiles pounded energy facilities and other infrastructure across Ukraine yesterday, the Ukrainian Air Force said, with strikes causing blackouts in parts of different regions. Russian military forces targeted energy facilities in western Ukraine, according to Ukrenergo, the country's power grid operator. It said repair crews were starting to repair the facilities after the rocket attack, but that restrictions were in place as they tried to restore the electricity supply. Hundreds of thousands of people in central and western Ukraine have woken up to power outages and periodic bursts of gunfire as Ukrainian air defense tries to shoot down drones and incoming missiles. Kira Rudik, a member of the Ukrainian parliament, said that 1.5 million people were without electricity after Russian strikes against power stations on Saturday. Ukraine's Prime Minister said that Russia has plunged Ukraine into a humanitarian catastrophe by attacking its energy infrastructure. Dennis Schmihal told the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine that Russia wanted to condemn Ukraine to a cold winter when many people could literally freeze to death. Ukrainian forces have pushed Russians out of the Kharivne and Chakalov settlements in the Kherson region, the Ukrainian Forces General Staff said yesterday. Iran's foreign ministry has strongly condemned a call by France, Germany and the UK for the UN to investigate accusations that Russia has used drones from Iran to attack Ukraine. Ukraine says Russia has used Iranian-made Shahed 136 attack drones. If true, the allegations would mark a breach of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined today by two fantastic guests. Carol Monaghan has been the SNP MP for Glasgow North West since the general election in May 2015. She is the SNP spokesperson on education, armed forces and veterans in the House of Commons. She has campaigned on the issue of research, treatment and attitudes towards ME, and back in June we reported that Carol led a 10-minute rule bill urging the UK government to grant asylum seekers the right to work. Carol, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
I'm very well, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are also joined by Anthony Salamone, FRSA. Anthony is the founder and managing director of European Merchants, the Scottish political analysis firm based in Edinburgh. He is a leading Scottish political scientist, analyst and thinker. Anthony, good afternoon. How are you?
Well, thank you, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you, and I'm delighted to see both you and Carol here joining us on the Full Scottish this afternoon. Our first item today, I've been reflecting on this over the last couple of days. I go away for a few days' holiday, and this happens. Boris Johnson is reported to be desperately seeking more Conservative MPs to support his comeback bid as he tries to secure the 100 nominations needed to enter the ballot to become Britain's next Prime Minister. Talks on Saturday night between Johnson and Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor and front-runner in the contest, did not result in any deal between the two contenders. If there had been a deal, we'd have heard about it by now, said one Johnson backer. Sunak is the favourite to succeed Liz Truss and already has 120 publicly declared nominations, according to Financial Times analysis, including the key right-wingers Kemi Badenoch and the former Brexit Minister Steve Baker. While many Tory MPs would like Johnson to back Sunak to ensure a speedy coronation of the former Chancellor, uniting the party, the ex-Premier believes still believes he can make a return to 10 Downing Street. Johnson's allies claim that he would win in a head-to-head fight with Sunak if the contest goes out to Tory party membership, and the former Prime Minister wants his rival to capitulate. "It's time for Rishi to put on his big boy trousers," said one Johnson supporter. But given that Johnson has only about 50 declared Tory MPs supporting him, and that's in spite of claims from his allies that more than 100 are willing to back him, Sunak's team do not believe that Johnson has the numbers. So, Carol, firstly, we'll take a broad approach to this and then we'll drill into it a little bit. So it's time perhaps to put on your William Hill hat. Who do you think will be the next Prime Minister on Friday? Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, or perhaps Larry the Downing Street cat?
Yeah, I mean, it's utterly fascinating, and it would be an amusing Netflix documentary, I think. But the fact is that, you know, normal people are actually feeling the pain of this at the moment. Possibly the better question, because actually I don't really care who becomes Tory MP. It's not going to change things dramatically, I don't believe, for people here in Glasgow. So I'm not that fussed about that. I think the bigger question is, how long can the next Prime Minister stay in post? And we've got all sorts. We've had the shortest serving Prime Minister. We've had several other short tenures, all since 2015. So I can't imagine this one's going to be any more successful. But if I'm to take a step back, it certainly looks like Sunak has the numbers. And Johnson, although if you look at Guido Fawkes's timeline and what he's reporting, people have told him, he is only just over 50 named supporters at the moment. And if you have a look at some of the names, there's some absolute crackers amongst those names. If you can imagine the hardest of the hard right Tory Brexiteers. And I'm going to, if you excuse me just for a wee second till I read you some of these names, because they're real crackers. We've got people like, for example, the lovely Paul Bristow, who is a character, not a nice one, Brendan Clark-Smith. We've got Andrea Jenkins, Christopher Chope, we've got Peter Bone, Jacob Rees-Mogg, of course, Edward Lee, Jonathan Gullis, who's a particularly unpleasant character. A couple that I'm surprised about, you know, Ben Wallace, for example, that was a surprise, Alex Sharma. But one this morning that's declared is Nadeem Zahawi, the very person that back in June told him he had to go, July told him he had to go. So I found Nadeem Zahawi quite an interesting one. So who knows, but I think it looks like Sunak's got the numbers, and if Johnson can't get the numbers by tomorrow, actually there'll be a new Prime Minister, I would say, sooner than Friday.
Thank you, Carol. That's a great perspective, and I want to talk to you a little bit more about your particular perspective from the benches opposite the government in a minute. But firstly, Anthony, I'll put the same question to you. If you'd put on your William Hill hat for a moment, who do you think will be the new Prime Minister by Friday? Johnson, Sunak, Mordaunt, or another?
Well, it's difficult to see how Boris Johnson could become Prime Minister again. I mean, of course, he could, ultimately secure the 100 plus nominations required, and he's still popular with a number of Tory party members. But I think that, a lot of Conservative MPs who traditionally were concerned with their own survival, perhaps they maybe not as much as they used to, are unhappy with that. Obviously he was forced out of office, only a few months ago. There's this Privileges Committee investigation, which is still ongoing about the Partygate scandal. So why would you want to be associated with that? I mean, I suppose it reflects on, the state of Westminster politics in the post-Brexit context, which has fundamentally changed how sort of, UK-based or UK-wide politics works. So it seems that, from what we can tell, Rishi Sunak is, best placed to sort of win amongst Tory MPs. And as Carol indicated, that, if he does well enough in MPs and amongst MPs and the sort of other contender or contenders withdraws, then sort of he becomes sort of Prime Minister by default without having to consult the membership. I suppose, what can we add that's different? It's interesting that in order to speed things up, the sort of consultation of Tory party members would be held online. Originally, that was meant to be a feature of the first, the most recent leadership contest, but was axed because of concerns reportedly from security services about sort of the safety of an online vote. But so it seems interesting that the Conservative Party was perhaps willing to adopt that suggestion before, but not now. Which is something to note. Also, the extent to which other countries are viewing this context or this contest and seeing what it means both for the stability of the UK and therefore the implications for wider Europe, and also sort of the cautionary lesson it sort of teaches to political leaders about trying to implement a radical agenda, which then falls apart. And I think it's been intriguing to see the extent to which in the United States and elsewhere in the European Union that politicians are worried that could this happen to me, and they're thinking about that in a way which you wouldn't necessarily expect, because when you look at it from a UK context, it's so much about the internal machinations of the Conservative Party or the implications of sort of post-Brexit context. But if you look at it from a wider perspective of if you try to implement a supply side economics, Reaganomics, Redux, economic policies for a larger European country today, we can see the results.
Thanks, Anthony. There's a number of points that you made there that I'd like that we will unpack this afternoon as we look at this more closely. Carol, I'll come back to you though. Firstly, given your particular perspective, sitting on the benches opposite the government, what do you think it was that tipped Liz Truss over the edge and convinced her to resign on Thursday? And also, what have you found to be the mood of Tory MPs, the Tory MPs who sit opposite you, in particular, the handful of Scottish Tory MPs? So two things. What was it that tipped Liz Truss over the edge, and what are Scottish Tory MPs, how are they reacting?
Well, firstly, I don't think Liz Truss chose to resign. I think she was given the boot. That's pretty obvious. So Wednesday was incredibly interesting. What we saw on Wednesday was pockets of Tory MPs meeting in dark corners all over Westminster. I happened to be standing outside the chamber. In fact, it's the school holidays in Scotland this week, so I had two of my daughters down in Westminster and was giving them a tour. And amongst all of this, the votes were over, we were way past time, and unusually the chamber was locked. And usually after hours it's open for a bit for people to see round. It was locked, and the next thing it got unlocked. Wendy Morton, who's one of the Tory whips, came storming out, followed by another Tory who turned to me, laughed and said, "Nothing to see here," and kept walking. So Wendy Morton was obviously particularly annoyed at that point. In another room, just along the corridor, we saw Tres Coffey, who's now acting PM. Tres Coffey in a huddle with Tory backbenchers. We saw Tory backbenchers, some laughing, some in tears, actually. And you've got to remember there is a personal element to all of this. Some of them were forced into those voting lobbies on Wednesday night and were really upset at what had happened and how that had come about. So, I mean, there was real upset. I met one Tory MP who said, "Oh, Carol," he said, "I need a hug." And another one standing beside him that was just laughing. And so I think there was a mixture of hilarity, sort of not real funniness, but sort of, just if I don't laugh, I'll cry. And others that actually were really upset. So I think we need to remember, I mean, if we're going to be sympathetic, I know it's hard to be sympathetic to Tories, but there is a human element here. And I think it's been quite difficult for a lot of Tory members. But what tipped Liz Truss over the edge, other than crashing the economy, I think was that on Monday and Tuesday, she basically hid. We didn't see her in Parliament. She had a dreadful performance at Prime Minister's questions, and then forcing people through a lobby on a vote on fracking and saying it was actually voting a confidence vote in the government was just too much, I'm afraid. And that was when the dam burst, and we saw the scenes that we saw on Wednesday night.
Thank you, Carol. I'm delighted that you're here with us today, and you can give us that insight into the hysteria that we saw unfolding on Wednesday, and which eventually led, as you say, to it being clear to the Prime Minister that she had to go. But Anthony, we'll come back to you again. One thing that you touched on was the current investigation by the Privileges Committee into Boris Johnson's conduct as Prime Minister. One thing that people have been talking about over the weekend is that if Johnson, and it's a big if Johnson is anointed as Prime Minister again, do you think would he seek to move to shut down the Privileges Committee investigation into his alleged lying and the proven breakdown of his breaking of lockdown rules, which the rest of us were able to abide by somehow, and more generally, another point that you made: if Johnson is anointed, what message does that send to the wider world?
Yeah, so on the first point, I suppose it's always possible that Boris Johnson could attempt to try to shut down the investigation into him if he becomes Prime Minister again. But we can look at other instances in which he's tried to do that before, for instance, in terms of Tory MPs that he sort of favoured over another. And of course, there was a public and parliamentary outcry, and ultimately he was unsuccessful in trying to sort of rewrite rules retrospectively. So my point is that he might try to do that, but he may well not succeed. We can also look at his wider record, for instance, obviously trying to prorogue Parliament during some of the Brexit parliamentary wars, which also didn't turn out well for him. So, yes.
Well, he
sure,
did. Sorry to interrupt, Anthony. He did prorogue Parliament. He illegally prorogued Parliament, and then was told that he had to go back on that. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Yeah, so my point, as Carol's illustrated, the point is that he is clearly willing to bend or break rules when it suits him, and sometimes he can get away with it, and sometimes he doesn't. So I suppose there's that's his past, which is clear to see, and people can judge from it whatever they will. In terms of so what message it sends if Boris Johnson became Prime Minister again, I think it highlights the continued continued uncertainty and concern for partners and in the rest of Europe and the wider world. And not on core issues, for instance, like support for Ukraine. Obviously that Boris Johnson tried to make that a hallmark of the end of his premiership to, first of all, which is perfectly legitimate, but secondly, to have something to point to. So not concerns in that sense, but concerns in terms of the political and economic stability of the UK, which obviously is important because, the UK is no longer part of the European Union, no longer part of the single market, but it's still a large economy and still a country that, that the European Union wants to be able to work with, wants to be able to rebuild bridges with over time and to, forge a closer relationship on plenty of different areas. And we can see that in the way in which the EU has tried to include the UK and the European political community, the new initiative to try to bring together states from across Europe that are both inside the EU and outside countries that are potential candidates, or indeed, in the UK's case, former members. The point is that the European Union wants to be able to work with the UK, but the UK, in particular the UK government, needs to be in first of all, a functional place, but also willing to try to forge that cooperation. I suppose that, if we contrast Liz Truss's very brief premiership with that of Boris Johnson seemed much more comfortable with a confrontational relationship with the EU. We were getting the impression, although it was, as I say, very brief, that Liz Truss was attempting to depart a bit from Boris Johnson's approach to the EU and to perhaps allow a degree of cooperation, political cooperation, the way that Boris Johnson was either him personally didn't like or was happy to allow hard Brexiteers to steer him away from. And if he returns, then sort of, be it on the European political community, be it on the Northern Ireland Protocol, we could be back to some of the divisiveness or greater divisiveness that we had before in terms of the relationship between the UK and the EU.
Thank you, Anthony. And Carol, to take Anthony's point a little bit further forward, do you think does the hysterical and chaotic Tory party know what it wants at all at the moment? And to expand on Anthony's point, do you think is the Tory party ever going to be able to fight off the virus of Brexit and the ERG, or should instead the Tory party be put out of its misery now?
The Tory party is in just such conflict at the moment, and there are two kind of groups, and this is where the split lies just now with the Tories. we've got Tories that understand that we have to open up the UK to immigration in order for our economy to actually flourish. So that's the first group. The second group are actually happy for the economy to dive, for people to feel pain of this just now, as long as we keep immigrants out. And that was what we saw earlier this week with Suella Braverman in her resignation. I mean, she might have told us the resignation was about sending something from the wrong email address, but really it was because Truss did want to be more open, did want to be slightly more relaxed with immigration. And Braverman, as a hardline Brexiteer, that was a red line for her. She was not willing to have any more immigrants, which is ironic, the daughter of immigrants herself, but she was not willing to have more immigrants in order to actually kickstart the economy. And that's where they are just now. And this tussle will continue. Either it needs a new government altogether, and I'm not sure that Sunak can solve this problem. And that's what we're seeing with the hardline Brexiteers. They're really torn just now between, I mean, where do they go in order to get these policies? They want to keep immigrants out. They don't keep it the damage it does. And I'm not sure how they can square that circle, as it were.
Thanks, Carol. Now we'll move on a little bit to look at the current UK political kaleidoscope from the perspective of economics, because Anthony, we've seen Jeremy Hunt abandon very nearly all of the Trussonomics which were announced only a few weeks ago. He's also begun signalling efficiencies, which I took to be Tory speak for budget cuts. And of course, that's against the backdrop of inflation already running at more than 10%, and so which is already squeezing everyone and every organisation. So if Hunt is now signalling budget cutting, is austerity 2.0 an inevitability for us all?
Well, it seems like it, sure. Yes. I mean, in one form or another, I suppose there's, the attempt is being made to draw a contrast between sort of not cutting budgets, but not increasing it in line with inflation, for instance, so that it might not be as much in the way of real terms cuts in cash terms for budgets for government departments, but that the value of that will decrease by not being raised to match inflation, for instance. So an attempt is being made to draw a contrast. I suppose in practice, it doesn't matter as much because, whether it's a cut in terms of cash terms, a cut in terms of inflation terms, yes, we're looking at budget reductions, or in a way, yeah. That is directly proportional, direct consequence of the sort of Trussonomics approach of this, mini budget that has collapsed and unpicked, that has spooked investors, raised interest rates, forced central bank intervention. All of that is a direct consequence of that. It's a very interesting when we during the Conservative, the most recent or preceding Conservative Party leadership election contest, there was talk of £40 billion of headroom, which would sort of facilitate or not be troubling in the sense of the tax cuts that Liz Truss ultimately wanted to propose, and then sort of added on top of further in the mini budget. And now we're in a complete opposite situation of needing to find billions, tens of billions, if not more, of potential cuts. So it's obviously a consequence of policy choices in terms of what government wants to spend money on or not. I'm sure many viewers of this program would say that, for instance, the UK government didn't renew Trident, then that would sort of free up a huge amount of funding for all the other kinds of priorities that we're talking about just now. So yes, governments do face difficult choices. These are challenging times, but I suppose the point is that there is more than one way forward, and it's not inevitable to see a return to the kind of austerity that we saw in the 2010s. But it seems that is the direction in which the UK government, or the Chancellor who is there right now, whoever will be there tomorrow, is sort of intent on pursuing.
Thank you, Anthony. Yes, the notion of us all taking a ticket in order that we know our turn when we each become Chancellor of the Exchequer certainly feels like a likelihood at the moment. But Carol, to be slightly more serious for a moment, what do you think we've been talking a little bit here. What do you think is necessary to bring a degree of stability back to the UK economic outlook after it? And I'm thinking about that particularly because we can now see the UK economic forecasts and the economic outlook being downgraded by ratings agencies. So what's necessary to bring stability and to seek to improve the credit rating for the UK now?
Yeah, if I could maybe just go back to your question, first of all, about austerity 2.0, can I say I don't
Sure.
think it's inevitable. I think we're already in it. You know, I'm getting emails from people on a daily basis who are struggling, who literally cannot find the money to pay the most basic of bills. This is people, many of whom are working, and literally their weekly budget does not add up. So whether it's imminent, I actually think we're there already. But in terms of how we get the UK economy back on track, I'm not entirely sure that's possible. I think it's possible to get the Scottish economy back on track, and that would come through independence, and it would come through rejoining the European Union, and it would come with the rich trade links and the ability for people to move freely. That's what's required. But I think for the rest of the UK, particularly when we're talking about some of these hardline Brexiteers, and by that I don't just mean MPs, I mean people that voted for Brexit, people that are continuing to vote Tory, people that would like to see someone like Boris Johnson back in power, they're not ready to rejoin the EU, and actually they're more willing to take the pain of continued Brexit than actually admit that this is not the correct path. So I think that's where we have to be. The interesting thing this time, though, and the interesting thing about why it's caused Liz Truss as much trouble as it has, is austerity of the early 2010s didn't affect me, you know, and it didn't affect me because actually my mortgage rates dropped. My pay didn't go up much, but you know, I can make ends meet. My mortgage rates dropped, and actually I didn't notice it terribly much. The difference this time round is with mortgage rates going through the roof, with inflation as bad as it is, with fuel prices as horrendous as they are at the moment. This is affecting far more than your working classes. This is affecting the middle classes, which is why it has upset the Tory party members and MPs as much as it has. So maybe some pain of austerity for the middle classes might actually force a change of thought, but I think it's a long path that they've still got to travel down.
Thanks, Carl. And staying with you for a moment, that's a very good point that you make. Do you think do the Tory MPs who you meet and other Tory supporters, do they actually believe in the economic mantra of trickle down, which was at the root of Trussonomics, or is there something else going on that means that they continue to support a Tory government and the economic policies that they seem determined to pursue?
That's a really good question. I don't think many of them support or believe that trickle down really works. However, what they believe in far more than anything is that they should remain in power and that they personally should remain as the MP for whichever little seat it is. So I think there's a huge amount of self-preservation going on at the moment, with the Tories repositioning themselves multiple times within a day, even according to what they think might keep them in power. But honestly, the trickle down, I think most of the sensible Tories could see that this was not a policy that was going to work and was going to cause some sort of jump start to the economy. So yeah, they're not daft, but they are more interested in self-preservation.
Thanks, Carol. That's useful and helpful insight. Thank you. Anthony, thinking a little bit more about where the current Chancellor is taking us, or is taking the UK economy, we're talking about the fiscal challenges that the Westminster government now faces. Do you think there's a prospect that the Chancellor, whoever that Chancellor is, might increase taxes even further, bearing in mind that we're at taxes at their highest for probably 70 years? Or on the other side of the account, how deep do you think the budget cuts are going to have to be in order to begin to address the black hole that has appeared in the UK's fiscal position over the past 2 or 3 weeks?
Yeah, I suppose it's difficult to say, but I mean, it could, if Jeremy Hunt is still the Chancellor by the time, whenever his statement is made, if it really is made on Halloween or if it's made at another point in time, could it include both tax rises and budget cuts or budget restraints? Yes, I suppose that's possible. I think that we're not in a good place to be having this kind of crisis. I mean, we've had so many challenges one after the other, some of them self-induced, some of them not. Brexit, self-induced, pandemic, not, but they've all they've all accumulated. So we're in a context where we have the long-term impacts of Brexit, the shorter term but still significant impacts of the pandemic. We have inflation, we have interest rates rising to attempt to tame inflation at the same time as the government was proposing huge tax cuts. We're not in an ideal, or borrowing costs going up, a large budget debt and deficit. So we're not in a good place to be able to deal with a crisis. We face multiple crises all at once. So it would be challenging for any government or for any chancellor. But if you add into the mix, as I said before, that some of this challenge, some of this damage directly results from the short 44, 45-day premiership of Liz Truss and the attempted sort of economic sort of reset or fiscal policy reset that they tried and then blew up. So, yes, I think that, the attempt from the Conservative perspective of Jeremy Hunt and whoever is still there in the nucleus of that kind of element of the Conservative Party is to, in their view, stabilize the sort of the public finances to regain market confidence. And that means making sort of budget cuts and or tax rises to sort of, satisfy markets or the OBR or whatever. But as I come back to the point that there are always choices in terms of what is prioritized and what's not. For instance, if there were tax rises, who would they be on? We saw that, some European countries have proposed windfall taxes, for instance, on energy companies who have gained significantly from the rising cost of energy because of the Ukraine war or generally. That's one kind of tax rise as opposed to other ones on ordinary people, for instance.
That's a very good point. Thank you, Anthony. And Carol, thinking more broadly now, thinking of the cost of energy, thinking of the wider economic context, do you think that the Scottish Government could or should be doing much more, to demonstrate that there is a very different path regarding energy, regarding our wider economy, and in so doing, demonstrating that path, demonstrating the potential future benefits of an independent Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about energy is, first of all, that we get very little. We talk about the wholesale energy costs. Now, let's be absolutely clear that there are two different things here. There's the electricity costs and there's the gas cost. And energy companies have been able to capitalise on the increase in the gas costs. A lot of our gas doesn't come from Russia. In fact, only a tiny percentage of gas used here in Scotland comes from Russia. So there shouldn't really even be that much of an increase in the gas cost. In terms of electricity costs, I get emails from constituents and they talk about, being able to see turbines around Glasgow. Even Whiteley Wind Farm is not terribly far from here. They can see the turbines. They know that we're producing huge amounts of renewable energy, so they can't understand why their electricity costs are going up by 3 times. And you've got to say, well, there are lots of other factors in here that are causing that, none of which are under the control of the Scottish Government. And it's interesting, if we look at producers of energy, we know that over the last few years, Scotland has been producing nearly 100% of its electrical energy by renewables. And yet it costs these producers a huge amount of money to actually feed that energy into the national grid. And I actually asked Boris Johnson about this when he was still Prime Minister back in the spring. And the costs are quite incredible. If you're a producer in Norway and you want to feed into the national grid, you pay £1.36 per megawatt hour to feed that money into the grid in order to generate income for yourself. In France, you pay 17 pence per megawatt hour. I think I've just jotted it down here. Germany, the Netherlands and the Luxembourg, they pay nothing. They can feed into national grid and pay absolutely nothing in order to get money from the energy they produce. In Scotland, the average cost to feed in energy from our renewable sources that we have all over Scotland is £7.36 per megawatt hour. That's for our own producers here in Scotland, in Whiteley Wind Farm, producing that energy. They have to pay £7.36 per megawatt hour to feed into the grid. So our own producers, our renewable producers here in Scotland, have been absolutely hammered. But of course, the national grid is not devolved to Scotland. That's still reserved to Westminster. Ofgem is it's a Westminster organisation. We don't have any power over that. So yes, the Scottish Government can talk about increasing the use of renewables and, you know, supporting renewable generation, but these companies still have to pay in, and that's all reserved to Westminster. So actually, until we get independence, we can't have a fair way of actually costing electricity or costing energy for those that are right next to renewable producers. We have the largest potential in Europe, and we have been totally stymied by this Westminster costing of energy production. So another reason why independence is absolutely necessary in order to get fair energy prices for people.
Thanks, Carol. That's a very good point that you make. The price of wind has not gone up, but the electricity bills that we're all paying have. But let's move away from the UK for a minute. We'll go across the Atlantic and look at politics a little bit in the United States for our next item, because on the same day that Steve Bannon was sentenced to 4 months in jail for contempt of Congress, the January 6th Select Committee has also subpoenaed the ex-president Donald J. Trump. So firstly, Anthony, thinking of the sentencing of Bannon and his response, what's your reflection on Bannon finally being sentenced for contempt of Congress and his particularly defiant response?
Well, everything about this, from the January 6th attack on the Capitol to the Bannon contempt case and everything about it. I mean, it's collectively a massive challenge for American democracy and democratic institutions. To what extent can the form of governance, which is both sort of set out in the Constitution, but also sort of has developed as an American tradition, survive the challenge of Donald Trump and his acolytes and associates, including Steve Bannon? I regret to say that it's unclear. Even at this stage, obviously, some people who are interested in the continued preservation of democracy may take heart from him sort of being found guilty and sentenced for the contempt charge that he faced. But that's only one aspect of it. The other side is that some people can say that so convictions of this kind or sentencing of this kind can present an opportunity for those people to consider themselves to generate sympathy from their supporters of being seen to sort of be persecuted in some way, rather than, for instance, it being an application of the law. In terms of the January 6th committee itself, and perhaps you might want to get into this in more detail or not, as more or less sort of wrapped up at least the principal part of its inquiry in terms of its evidence and gathering from everyone, perhaps except Donald Trump, and it was presented that I think maybe a week ago or so in great detail, using video, audio, text messages, everything, to present a very disturbing picture of the events that led up to the attack on the Capitol, and how that attack played out, and how it was sort of, not resolved, but ended in a sense. And it was very harrowing to see the images and footage of how members of Congress were hiding and trying to respond and so on, and to think that can happen in what is meant to be a democratic system today. It's very worrying.
Thanks, Anthony. It's probably worth putting into context, in particular with regard to Donald Trump, it's probably worth putting into context a little bit of the legal challenges that are facing Trump and his OCG. There are missing government records. The US Justice Department is conducting a criminal investigation for Trump retaining government records, including some marked classified, after he left office in January 21. The FBI seized 11,000 documents from Mar-a-Lago in Florida in a court-approved August 8th search, including about 100 documents marked classified, some designated top secret. In New York, the Attorney General has filed civil suit against last month, saying that her office has uncovered more than 200 examples of misleading asset valuations by Trump and the Trump Organization between 2011 and 2021. Letitia James has accused Trump of inflating his net worth by billions of dollars, and she is seeking to permanently bar Trump, his sons Donald Jr. and Eric, and his daughter Ivanka from running companies in New York State, and to prevent them and the companies from buying new properties or taking out new loans in the state for 5 years. The Trump Organization is set to go to trial on October 24th on New York State criminal tax fraud charges. Its former chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, is also named as a defendant in the civil lawsuit, has pled guilty and is required to testify against the Trump Organization as part of his agreement with prosecutors. Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan district attorney, has also been investigating whether Trump misled lenders and others about his asset valuations. E. Jean Carroll, a former writer for Elle magazine, sued Trump for defamation in 2019 after Trump denied her allegations that he raped her in the 1990s in a New York City department store. Trump appeared on Wednesday for a deposition in the case, according to his and Carroll's lawyers, and in a letter made public on September 20th, a lawyer for Carroll said she is also planning to sue Trump for battery and intentional infliction of emotional distress under a new state law in New York, which gives adult accusers a 1-year window to bring civil claims over alleged civil misconduct, regardless of when it occurred. Then, as Anthony was saying, the House of Representatives committee investigating the January 6 assault by Trump supporters on the US Capitol is investigating whether Trump broke the law in actions trying to overturn his 2020 election defeat. The rioters, of course, sought to block Congress from certifying the election results, and the committee unanimously voted last week to subpoena Trump as part of its probe. Then there's the Georgia election tampering probe. A special grand jury was selected in May to consider evidence in Georgia prosecutors' inquiry into Trump's alleged efforts to influence the state's 2020 election results. That investigation focuses in part on a phone call Trump made to the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, a Republican, on January the 2nd, 2021. Trump asked Raffensperger to find votes needed to overturn his election loss. Legal experts say that Trump may have violated at least 3 Georgia criminal election laws: conspiracy to commit election fraud, criminal solicitation to commit election fraud, and intentional interference with performance of election duties. Now, Carol, after that lengthy shopping list of legal woes facing Trump and his OCG, do you think is Donald Trump and his gang any closer to facing justice anytime soon?
Do you know, it's really hard to say, because you would have thought that he would have been found out even before he became president, and many were very surprised that he made it as far as he did, considering the particular character that he is. So it is hard to say. He is, I mean, if you look at the Bannon and Trump and Johnson, of course, as well, you've got a group of people that think they're above the law. They think the law doesn't apply. It applies to normal people, to ordinary little people, but they're too important and too, too famous, too brilliant, too whatever to actually obey the laws that apply to other people. So it will be interesting to see what happens. But I do think there are many opportunities for sort of escape lanes for Trump. I understand the date, so he's got till around the 4th of November to produce particular documents. He's expected to appear, or certainly they've asked him to appear around about the 14th of November for the deposition testimony. Now, if he refuses to do those things, the committee might refer the matter to the Department of Justice, and that might trigger criminal charges. But there's a lot of kind of ifs and buts along the way. So it's hard to say whether he will actually face proper justice as a result of this. It's interesting, the subpoena that was given to him, there was one sentence from it that I thought was really interesting, and it says, "You were at the centre of the first and only effort by any US president to overturn an election." I think that's quite telling that of all the US elections we've ever seen, of all the UK elections we've ever seen, and yes, there have been controversial ones, and of course there was a controversy over Florida and Bush a number of years back, but of all the controversial elections, that statement only applies to Donald Trump. So certainly we'll all be watching eagerly what happens. But if you look at the behaviour of Steve Bannon since his sentencing, he is still the arrogance is still there. There is no humility. There's no sucking back from his position. So I think they still believe they can get away with this, and their behaviour would reflect that.
Thanks, Carol. Those are some very good points that you were making there. But for our final item this afternoon, let's come back to Scotland, because on Monday, our First Minister announced the latest paper on Scottish independence, this time focusing on the economy. As Anthony would describe it, it was paper number 3. That paper committed to establish a central bank by Independence Day and to introduce a new Scottish currency as soon as practicable after independence. So, Anthony, what are your reflections on this latest paper from the Scottish Government, paper number 3?
Yes, I think it's important to have as meaningful a conversation about these papers as possible, regardless of sort of what people think about independence generally or particular aspects of independence. So for me, my first impression is that it was quite a collection of different topics, which was rather strange. It talked about economic policy, talked about fiscal policy, talked about monetary policy, borders, EU membership, all clumped into one in a way which, you may say on the one hand, the theme was demonstrating a comprehensive, if you like, economic case for independence. On the other side, you might say, if the aim is to try to set out clearer proposals for what independence might look like or how the transition to independence might work, you would see those as being separate papers, for instance, a separate paper on currency from one on economic policy and so on. So a collection of different topics, which on the whole didn't go into a great deal of detail. Again, there are competing priorities. On the one hand, you might want to say that, well, we need to set out the basic tenets of what we aim to do, because even though we've said many times as a political party, the SNP would say, that we intend to join the European Union, or we will eventually establish a Scottish currency after a period, that needs to be reflected in the documents in some way. And of course, that's true. But at the same time, none of the papers today have talked about how the transition to independence would really work much beyond headline level of generality, which we already knew. So I think it will be interesting to see the extent to which future papers talk about not just sort of what Scotland could be or what the SNP or the current Scottish government proposed Scotland could be, but how would we get there?
That's a very good point, Anthony. Thank you. Carol, turning to you for a moment, in terms of this process of issuing white papers consecutively, do you think, is the Scottish Government building the case for independence quickly enough, given the current circumstances that we're in?
Well, I think it's important that there are these papers that people can use and can refer to. However, I do think it's also important that the opportunity is capitalised on, presents herself. Now, here we have a situation where we have a collapsing UK government, we have an economy that's going through the floor, we have people here feeling the real pain of austerity, and and still we haven't asked for a Section 30. So for me, I would like to see a wee bit more urgency. These white papers are important, and it's important that we do have a sensible case. But if you think about two big kind of political changes that happened, they happened as a result of 7 words: make America great again and take back control. Those 7 words changed the political landscape worldwide, certainly for us here in the UK with Brexit, certainly for the US with Trump. So when we looked at Brexit in the lead up to that EU referendum vote, there wasn't multiple white papers and costings and details and plan A, plan B, plan whatever else. There was just is this the sort of UK that you want? Is this the Britain that you want to live in? And people went for it on that. So I think on that basis, I think there has to also be an understanding that there's hearts and minds here, as well as the academic papers, which have real importance. We also need a campaign, we need the power behind it, and we need to remember that for many people, actually, there's an element of urgency, not just because they want independence, but now because we need independence. We need independence to be successful, and literally now we need independence to put food in people's stomachs.
A very powerful case made there, Carol. Thank you very much. Anthony, turning to you, we've seen again this morning conversations with regard to the challenges of what is described as the challenge of moving to a new currency in an independent Scotland. I think some were speculating, more highly than that it would take years to move to a new currency, whereas the Scottish Government has said that an independent Scotland would move to a new currency as soon as practicable. And I'm reminded that in Slovakia, it took 1 month and 7 days to move to a new currency. In Slovenia, it took 3 months, 13 days. North Macedonia took 7 months. Estonia took 10 months. Moldova took 27 months. And Ukraine itself took 60 months and 9 days to move to a new currency. So, do you think that obviously currency has been an argument that was bandied around in 2014 and has continued to be a talking point? So, do you think, is there any prospect of the discussion and the arguments around currency, of them moving forward and moving to a place where perhaps the discussions and the debate is slightly better informed?
Well, I hope so, because I mean, currency seems to be such a central facet of the independence debate in a way which I sometimes find odd, because of course, I mean, a currency is important. To what currency you're going to use, sure, that matters to people, but it should be fairly evident that the default position, if a country is independent, that it either has its own currency that it sort of issues itself, or that it's part of a currency union like the euro. To me, that's just obvious. It would be rather strange to be in a position in which you were, for instance, Scotland were to become independent and not eventually have its own currency. So that's one element. Yes, a sort of a debate that reflects sort of the realities of what it means to be an independent state and the important but not sort of existential role of currency in that. Other elements that are worth considering. One is the role of currency in EU membership. Does Scotland need to have a currency to apply to join the EU? No. Does Scotland need to have a plan to inform the European what it intends to do on currency? Yes, very much so. And I think that does require an indicative timetable, not a fixed date, but certainly a range of saying that, for instance, within 5 years or even 10 years of whatever time frame, whatever point this plan is being made is when we intend to move to a new currency, and how it will work, what impact it would have on the Scottish economy, and ensuring that this plan minimizes any potential spillover effects for the single market, which obviously would matter a lot to the EU. And then perhaps another element, and indeed this paper makes no mention of it whatsoever, is Scotland's relationship with the euro. which is to say that, would Scotland be forced to join the euro? No, but it would be very useful to have a productive conversation about the pros and cons of not being in the euro, given that as of January 1st, 20 of 27 EU member states will be in the eurozone. The non-euro group is small and not particularly influential. And for many people in the EU, in EU institutions and in national capitals, the euro is a core pillar of the EU, on a par with, if not more important than, the single market. And so Scotland would be on the periphery, geographically speaking, of the EU. Does it want to choose to be on the political periphery of the EU by not being part of the euro? And even if the consequences, yes, we're content with that. We want to have a Scottish currency and not eventually join the euro some years after that. But that the debate reflects that there are consequences, strategic consequences, not just economic or fiscal or monetary consequences of choosing not to be part of a core pillar of the European Union.
Thank you, Anthony. Informed and helpful discussion on currency, which is not something that we hear very much in the independence debate at the moment. But Carol, coming back to you finally, with no other major political party in the UK committed to rejoining the EU, is independence the only way for Scotland to get back into the EU?
Certainly, in the near future, it is. I think the rest of the UK will eventually go through some sort of conversion and will understand the damage that they're doing to themselves, and that being in the EU is important for economic success. But I do think that's going to take a long time. So for Scotland, the best chance of joining Europe, certainly anytime soon, is through independence, and that's what we should be working towards. And if I can just say a little bit about currency, obviously Anthony's much more of an expert on this than me, but I do think we've got this kind of hold of the pound, and we're really nervous about shifting away from the pound. Got to remember, many countries have gone through many different currencies on their route to independence, and I always like to talk about Lithuania, that after independence used the ruble, then the talonas, then the litas. I might be saying some of these wrong. It was the lita was pegged to the euro, and then finally joined the euro. The currency, you need a currency, but I do think we maybe shouldn't have such an emotional connection to the pound. We need to trade in something, but it doesn't need to be the currency of the rest of the UK.
Completely. Carol, thank you very much for those important points that you were making, and bringing, and to you both for bringing some better perspective to the current currency debate. However, I'm afraid to say that is all that we have time for this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. You will find our appeals for assistance on Facebook and Twitter, because the urgent need for financial support has not gone away, and we have set ourselves a target of 10,000 new subscribers in order that we can begin to recruit and pay permanent staff. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can also find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot and on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. I hope that you have enjoyed a tasty, full Scottish this afternoon. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who has been watching, and a very special thanks to our very special guests, Carol Monaghan MP and Anthony Salamone. Thanks, guys.